North Texas Revealed presents Dynasties of Collin County.
Collin McKinney, the legend and namesake of Collin County and the city of McKinney, was a delegate to the General Convention of Washington on Nebraska, who helped draft the Texas Declaration of Independence from Mexico, and later the Constitution of the Republic of Texas. He was also one of several men who capitalized on cheap labor. Here we present the ugly truth behind the scenes of North Texas' both powerful and influential citizens.
Born from opportunity and ambition, the early settlers of North Texas created everlasting dynasties from the free land acquired during the early colonization of the Spanish Tejas region. These men who braved all conditions to conquer the land and its inhabitants carved up empires of vast wealth and resources, seizing the moment to settle where land was cheap and easily acquired. They brought with them the vision and traditions of the South's successful agricultural dynasty. And it was mainly these southern traditions which thrived from use of free labor which made them evil by nature.
The average settler in North Texas at the time were hardworking farmers who raised crops to meet their family's needs, crops that could be sold locally to neighbors throughout the local area. Sustenance-driven farmers did not create vast wealth without the ability to move their product to other markets. While there were some waterways in the area, most would have to rely on land-based transportation, not suitable at the time for moving crops to markets of the east. Eventually roads were cut and teamsters could be hired to transport crops to Jefferson and other land ports to the east. But this method was time-consuming and cumbersome, and the labor force relying on individual family members and single men seeking opportunities meant that production of crops was meek at best. With Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821, the Mexican Constitution left the reviled subject of slavery up to the individual Mexican states to decide for themselves. The Spanish and Mexican governments despised the practice. It was Europe's development of cotton as a lighter industrial fiber over wool that created a vast need for the product and the potential for generational wealth in the South. Opportunistic men seized the moment to capitalize on a high-demand product of cotton for the markets in Europe. This quickly created vast plantations across the southern states, which utilized the institution of slavery. Stephen F. Austin in 1824 said, "The primary product that will elevate us from poverty is cotton. We cannot do this without the help of slaves." By mimicking the successful business model of the Mississippi plantation, he hoped to bring vast prosperity to Texas. Stephen's brother James lobbied the Mexican state of Coahuila to allow slavery to exist within its northern territory in Texas. To accomplish this, the lobbyists proposed allowing slavery to be imported as contract labor. They simply asked that the law be passed that would allow contracts written from other lands to be honored in the state of Coahuila, Texas. The Coahuila government agreed to honor contracts signed in other countries and territories, and in doing so created a loophole that slave owners needed to bring vast numbers of free labor to the landholders in Texas. They would simply bring their slaves to the port of New Orleans, free them, and make them sign contracts of 99-year servitude. This practice spread far and wide through advertisements in newspapers throughout the United States to get past the Mexico ban on slavery. The use of these contracts opened a floodgate of entrepreneurs seeking to eke out generational wealth for their family. Cotton had already become the world's most sought-after commodity, and the agricultural business model that included slavery came to Texas. While the Collin County area saw a boom in the production of the crop between 1820 and 1846, the use of slavery was widely opposed and only implemented in small numbers compared to the vast plantations developed in southeast Texas. Those who had slaves in Collin County were the minority by far, averaging only a few slaves. Of those who had them, however, some would embrace the business model and reap the benefits as a result. Prominent families of social and economic means grew within a few generations, and it's easy to see which family names had utilized slavery to gain their power and privilege. A look at the 1860 slave schedules of Collin County answers this question quickly. Here are a few of the largest slave owners in the county: McKinney, Foreman, Dowell, Jones, Shirley, Meads, Morris, Roseman, Abston, Hoffman, Waddill, Boyd, Bufford, Harrington, Carr, Graves, Simmons, Allen, Men were not alone. In some cases, women in the county held land in slaves, property for which they considered necessary in order to provide for their security and happiness. Let's take the McKinney family as one example of this business model. Collin McKinney married Miss Annie Moore February 13, 1793. They had 4 children, only 2 surviving to adulthood, Ashley and Polly. When his wife Annie died in May of 1804, Collin married Betsy Coleman on April 14, 1805. Together they had 7 children. Collin bought 640 acres of land from the Rob Whitaker survey, north of present-day Anna, Texas, from Anna Whitaker for $500. He had lumber hauled from Jefferson to build a home. Collin McKinney cabin was a 1.5-story home with 3 bedrooms downstairs and a loft upstairs. The lumber for the home was planed on his property by slaves. Collin owned 29 of them. Taxable values for the 1860 census revealed that in real estate he held $16,500 worth and $20,000 in Collin's personal estate. In 1860, slaveholders in southeast Texas averaged around 30% of the population, while in Collin County the average was about 9% of the population. In 2015, the Salina Record reported cemetery found near Collin McKinney homestead, which pointed to sharecroppers and possibly slaves being buried on the original property, marked with non-native plants like roses and honeysuckle. Collin's son William Coleman McKinney married Margaret Peggy Dooley. They had 9 children. In 1860, William McKinney had a taxable value of $38,000 in real estate, $20,000 in his personal estate. He also owned 27 slaves. Here are a few of the well-known family names of Collin County showing slaves, real estate, and personal estate reported in the 1860 census. R.L. Waddill and George Shackelford Morris came to McKinney in 1853 from Kentucky. Judge Waddill and his stepson, George Morris, both bought large tracts of land and built a home in McKinney. Once completed, the rest of the family joined them there, including the judge's wife, Sarah, and their children, R.L., Joe, Ben, Gaston, and Fanny. Later, this home would burn and a new home would be built. The second home, Waddill Morris homesite at 300 West Lamar Street in McKinney, Texas, has remained in the hands of family for more than 100 years. R.L. Waddill had 14 slaves. As one of the larger slaveholders in Collin County, George S. Morris held 16 slaves. However, he is listed as insane and living within the household of R.L. Waddill, who reported owning 14 of his own slaves in 1860. For George Morris, it says R.L. Waddill in trust of George S. Morris on the slave schedule. One might speculate that R.L. Waddill had power of attorney of stepson George S. Morris, that they both claimed land, built one home in which to live, and it was Waddill who managed the slave property and estate of George Morris. George passed away in 1910 and is buried beside R.L. Waddill at Congrove Cemetery in McKinney, Texas. George had been a private assigned to Company K of the 5th Texas Partisan Rangers of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Louis Shirley settled here in 1852 at an area that would later become Highland, Texas. He was able to acquire vast real estate holdings while raising his family. In 1860, he held 23 slaves. He died at the age of 72 in 1867 and was buried on family land. Louis, William M. Shirley, and Albert Shirley were all buried on family land, along with his slaves and their family. Later, the 3 men would be reinterred at the new cemetery established in 1889 called Melissa Cemetery. Slaves, freedmen, and sharecroppers of the Shirley family would remain on the same farmland, which was less than 100 yards northeast of the Melissa Cemetery and was later used by the St. Paul Baptist Church and the community as a black burial ground and became known as the St. Paul Baptist Cemetery. Hiram Brinlee was born December 25, 1808 in Tennessee. He and his brother George Carroll Brinlee arrived in Texas by wagon train in 1824 at Hickman's Prairie, far northeast Texas. Hiram Brinlee married Elizabeth Ann McKinney, niece of Collin McKinney, on September 13, 1832. After the Big Red River flood, they moved with the McKinney family, Hiram settling in 1838 at what would become the Chambliss community. He received a land grant 4 miles east of Melissa along Sister Grove Creek for 1,622 acres, where he farmed, operated a blacksmith shop and general store at Stony Point. Hiram Brinlee had 5 slaves in 1860. Hiram passed away July 28, 1885, with burial at the Brinlee Cemetery. At age 76, he had lived under 4 flags in Texas. All his sons and son-in-laws had fought in the Civil War. John Kendall Bumpass was born in 1829 at Roxboro, North Carolina, to Robert Davy Bumpass Sr. and Nancy Marietta Davy. John Kendall's father, Robert Davy, was a large plantation owner near Middle Creek, North Carolina, having more than 100 slaves. Each of his children had a personal body servant, and each child was given specific responsibilities in particular phases of plantation production, whether they be farming, ranching, commercial, etc. John worked as a merchant in North Carolina and married Elizabeth Thomas in Greenville County, North Carolina. In 1857, John and his brother, William Bumpass, moved with both their wives and their children to Farmersville, where they engaged in farming and ranching. William Bumpass reported 4 slaves in the 1860 census and a Millwood real estate value of $2,500 and personal estate of $6,000. In 1860, John was listed in the federal slave schedules as owning 7 slaves, with Millwood real estate of $3,000 and a personal estate worth $8,000. In 1862, John enlisted in the Confederate Army at Farmersville and served as captain of the company of Martin's Battalion with Mounted Volunteers. After the war, he moved his family to Terrell, Texas. He was a member of the State Constitutional Convention in 1865, became active in the Democratic conventions, canvassing the state. He made speeches for all caucuses which he believed in. He was elected in the 24th legislature, where he chaired several committees on public land. John died August 9, 1899 in Terrell. He was buried on the property at Rose Hill Farm, 5 miles north of Nevada, but in 1902 his remains were reinterred at the IOOF Cemetery in Farmersville. His mother and father were reinterred at the J.E. Jones Mausoleum at the same time. John's brother, Robert Davy Bumpass Jr., served as sergeant in Company F of the 5th Texas Rangers for the Confederate States of America. He drowned while attempting to cross the Red River during the war, and his body was buried there by an old walnut tree near Paris, Texas. Indian newspaper ran an article April 17, 1902, which revealed that his brother, William P. Bumpass, had promised his mother before she died that he would honor her request to find the body of his brother and bring him home to be buried beside her. William P. Bumpass did find the bones of Robert with the help of Travis G. Wright and a former slave who had remembered this site of where the old walnut tree had been located. Robert's remains were moved to the family IOOF Cemetery in Farmersville. Robert Davy Bumpass Jr. had 4 slaves with a Farmersville real estate value of $1,200 and her personal estate of $350. One particularly disturbing story is that of William Ambrose Bumpass, who was the son of Robert Davy Bumpass Jr. and Nancy Merritt Davy. William had come with his family from North Carolina and had lived with his sister Nanny Bumpass Jones at Aleo with the rest of the family. It is said that he lived a quiet life, mostly with his sister, and died at the age of 52 at the home of another sister, Margaret Smith. William was also buried at the Rose Hill Farm burial ground on John's land. Bumpass Cemetery, as it was called, was only 10 feet square and originally had several family members buried there. As already mentioned, all of those remains were reinterred in 1902 at Farmersville, except for William Ambrose Bumpass. William was purposely left behind because he was mentally deficient. Thanks for watching, and remember to like and subscribe.